Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
The Curse of the Wolf, Part 5 of the Wolfman Series. Well, Jack pored through the photographs again and again, looking for a clue. Who put the mysterious envelope in his room? Whose photographs were these? And why does that woman look exactly like his sister Kat? Old Jack rushed downstairs to the inn's kitchen to ask the innkeeper who had left the envelope of photographs. Now, Gerta, she was cooking a large pot of beef stew on the stove, and she glanced up as Jack walked in. When asked, she replied, I was the one that put the envelope in your room, but I don't know who left it. Someone rang the bell, and when I opened the door, this was laying on the welcome mat with a little note attached that had your name on it. I looked up and down the street, and I didn't see anyone, so I brought it in, and I placed it on your night table. I assumed it would be all right since I was going to change the linens anyway. Is something wrong? Well, Jack assured her that everything was fine and turned to go back to his room. But on second thought, he turned and asked Gerta if she knew anything about the werewolf legends in this area. Oh, sure, she said. This valley has a long history of werewolves. Many years ago, wolves were abundant in our forests. Really, there were too many of them, and their prey became scarce. Now, they started getting very bold. They would come right into town hunting for stray dogs and cats. And many children went missing too. There is a tale of a woman who was out hanging her linens on a line when a wolf came into her yard and attacked her. And as the wolves became more aggressive, the stories of men turning into wolves, they became more frequent. Gerta went back to her cooking, and Jack remembered that one of the photographs had the words Harz Mountains written on the back. He asked Gerta if she knew anything about it. Oh, yeah, there's a very old village in the Harz Mountains where all the residents are said to be werewolves. They're gypsies. They came from Bulgaria many years ago. And the neighboring villages say that when the gypsies come into town, all the townspeople, still to this day, they rush their children and their pets inside. They mostly live on the deer and the wild game from the forest, but sometimes there are other things they hunt. The men are quite handsome, and many a young girl has lost her heart to the Romani charm, never to be seen again. Now, the women are very beautiful and sensual with their dark eyes and their olive skin. They're fortune tellers, you see. I grew up near there, and my sister still lives near the village, and she said they often come to town in an old sheep herder's wagon and park just outside of city limits to sell their wares. They say that the woods are full of men who have been seduced by the gypsy women and transformed them into wolves. If you're ever in the forest at night, you'll hear them howling. Now, there is a dark curse upon that village, Gerta replied, while she spooned out a large bowl of soup. How do I get there? Jack asked. The Harz Mountains are the land of German fairy tales. Steep-roofed, half-timber houses with narrow cobblestone streets, dark forests, rushing streams, and stormy mountains. This forest was the home of wicked witches, dwarves digging in caverns under the earth, and poor woodcutters in lonely cottages. The brothers Grimm collected their stories from this area. The highest mountain in the Harz is the Brocken. According to local legend, witches gather there every year on top of the Brocken for a German version of Halloween. The place that Jack was searching for was a little-known village far off the beaten path outside the small town of Thale, which lies at the entrance to a beautiful river gorge. It has a gondola that takes you to the mountaintop. It's famous for pagan rituals and has a history of witchcraft and human sacrifice. Now, the Hexentansplatz, which is German for the witches' dancing place, literally, is the actual name of one of the two mountains looming over Thale. During pre-Christian times, this was an important site for secret pagan ceremonies. Legend has it that this was where the witches gathered before their flight to the Brocken, and They held human sacrifices there. Now the gondola is still operating, and Jack bought a ticket for two. Gerda was excited to accompany Jack on this trip. She hadn't seen her sister in over a year, and she had offered to take Jack to Thale so she could visit her sister. Well, Jack didn't realize that Germany was so steeped in witch and werewolf lore. He'd never really thought about it. He'd had no reason to. Oh, he'd heard of the Brothers Grimm, sure, but he grew up reading the likes of Louis L'Amour and Zane Grey. He was a cowboy, not a damn werewolf hunter. But he had to admit this was interesting, and he appreciated having Gerda's company. She was pleasant to converse with and eager to share her knowledge of the local lore. As a young girl, she and her sister had lived a life right out of a fairy tale themselves. They'd lived deep in the forest, and their father was a woodcutter, their mother was a baker. She baked loaves of bread for the storekeeper in town and would place the loaves of bread in a basket for the girls to carry to market. And believe it or not, they wore little red capes and carried the baskets of bread through the forest to leave with the storekeeper. Well, Gerda explained that many of the fairy tales that the Brothers Grimm wrote were actual stories of how life was lived back in those days. She and her sister, they had worn red hooded capes because they wanted to be sure that they were seen, much like hunters will wear orange vests today while traipsing through the forest. If men were out hunting, they wouldn't shoot at something red moving through the forest. It was for their protection. So the smell of the bread would draw wild animals to them, especially bears, but also wolves. So the girls had necklaces of garlic woven that they wore as garlic repelled the wild animals. The girls grew up with tales of werewolves and the constant fear that they might be attacked on their daily walk into town to deliver their mother's bread. She laughs about it now, but it was a real fear when she was a child. Well, Jack and Gerda bought tickets for the gondola ride up to the top of the mountain. The views were tremendous. Jack had brought the envelope with the photographs that Gerda had left in his room, and he recognized that a couple of the photographs had this very view or something very similar in the background. And he thought about showing the photographs to Gerda, but she was busy talking with the other passengers on the gondola ride up the mountain. In the morning, before he and Gerda left, he had called both Professor Luther and Ludolf Jäger to see if either of them had left the envelope of photographs. They both denied it and were as curious as he was of where they'd come from. It couldn't have been Rebecca. She would have invited herself right in and spent the afternoon talking with Gerda. But who else could have left that envelope? Now, Jack promised Ludolf that he would stop by after they returned from this trip to Thale. He was going to show him the envelope. And he was looking forward to his meeting with the professor the week before the full moon to start his round of tincture and hopefully be cured. Well, the envelope held 24 photographs. Most were of the same family, a man, a woman, and a young boy and a girl. The picture showed them posing in front of a camera in very formal attire, as if they were having a family portrait taken. It was difficult to judge the ages, but the period of dress and the condition of the print made him think it was from the early 1900s. An additional portrait showed them as the children were growing up. The boy appeared to be a few years older than the girl, and even as a child, there was an uncanny resemblance to his little sister Kat. Other photos showed an old half-timber farmhouse, various pictures of the kids and the animals, and the odd photo of the werewolf kneeling over the woman, and the one with the woman whose face looked exactly like Kat's. In the background of the photos, there were mountains and a landscape that looked identical to the Harz Mountains that he and Gerda were now exploring. One of the photographs even appeared to have been taken from this very gondola. He was anxious to look around the village of Thale and see if he could identify the old farmhouse that was in several of the photographs. And why had he been led to this location in the first place? All of it appeared to be a little too familiar, yet that must be his imagination. He'd never been to Germany before, although it was possible that he had seen pictures. Suddenly, a memory sprang forward in his mind of a photo album his mother had tucked away on a high bookshelf when he was very young. Now, he'd been snooping through his parents' books, not looking for any any one thing in particular. He was just bored. It was when Kat was sick with the fever, and he felt like he needed to stay near her, not go outside to play with his friends or ride his bike. His dad was away at work, and his mother had gone to the store. Kat was asleep on the sofa in the front living room, and Jack had decided to explore the books on the bookshelves. He found the photo album, and he had looked through it. He remembered seeing several photographs of a location he wasn't familiar with at the time. This location, the exact one he was now viewing. No wonder it all felt familiar. But what was the connection? And what did his family have to do with all this? And who was the family in the photographs? As he sat in silence pondering the mysterious photographs, Gerda was absorbed in a conversation with another passenger on the gondola ride up to the top of the mountain. It was a relief to have a few moments to himself. Gerda was a pleasant enough companion, but she rarely stopped talking. His thoughts drifted off again to the Jaegers. When they had first arrived in Montana and purchased that spread out by Buck Humphrey's ranch, they stuck to themselves. They didn't socialize or spend any time getting to know their neighbors. He did remember that his mother went over there with a welcome to the neighborhood, peach pie, but other than that, he didn't think his family had ever had any contact with him, at least not that he knew of. And yet, he knew the Jaegers had come from this part of Germany, and he'd met Gunther's relatives, and his mother had a photo album with pictures from this area. Now, Kat was having visions of werewolves, and Jack was now turning into one. What was the connection? Well, Jack picked up on the thread of conversation between Gerda and the other passenger that she was talking with as the gondola neared the top of the peak. They had been speaking in German, so it was easy to gloss over their conversation, but suddenly they had switched to English, and they were looking directly at Jack. The passenger, she was admiring Jack's cowboy hat. "He's a real cowboy," Gerda said proudly, "just like John Wayne. He has cows and a ranch and everything." And Jack chuckled to himself. All it takes is a cowboy hat. Well, they stepped off the platform onto the witch's dance floor. The views were spectacular. Dense forest as far as the eye could see with the waterfalls and rock formations scattered throughout the landscape. It was really breathtaking. Now, the group of tourists headed down the hiking trail, and Jack, he managed to step off the main path and go off on his own to explore. This wasn't really a sightseeing trip for him. He needed answers, and for some reason he had been led to this location. He had the feeling that there was something here he was supposed to find, some kind of sign or message well, he looked up from the path and paused. Right in front of him was a sight identical to one of his photographs. It was a tree, dead and stark against the sky on a knoll above the path. Branches dark and burnt from lightning strikes, most likely. The tree was circled by large boulders and mounds of grass. Names had been carved into the burnt bark. He climbed over the large rocks and made his way up to the tree and began searching the names carved there. It took a while to find, but there were the names he was looking for. A large carved heart circled the word, Gunther and Hannah Jaeger, married October 11, 1960, Catherine, born August 9th, 1970, Hans, born September 16th, 2000. So there was a daughter, and her name was Catherine? But Jack's sister Catherine was born on August 9th, 1970 as well. Dizziness flooded through Jack's mind. He quickly sat down. What the hell? Was this a coincidence, or was Catherine not really his sister? At least not by blood. He searched the names on the tree for anything else that looked familiar, but the names were not ones he recognized at all. He took out his phone and he snapped a photo of the tree and the inscription. Well, what's next, he wondered. Gerda and the others were waiting for him when he arrived back at the gondola landing. Gerda quickly filled him in on the landmarks she had seen. The story of the witches flying from the mountain and the festival that occurs every year to celebrate that event. He waited till they were sitting back on the gondola for the ride down the mountain to tell her about the tree. And Gerda was disappointed that the tour guide had not taken the group there. That evening, as they sat at the supper table with Gerda's sister, Jack explained that he was searching for information about a family he had known in the States, the Yeagers. He explained that he thought there might be a connection to his family and to this specific region. Gerda's sister grew more excited with every detail Jack had relayed. She was the local historian for the newspaper and thought she might be able to help him dig up some stories. Well, Jack decided to bring out the photographs and show them all to her. Luella, that was Gerda's sister's name, immediately recognized the half-timber farmhouse. I've driven by it many times. There's a family living there. Farm animals, very nice large garden. I always thought it was a very quaint, beautiful old house. Very old architecture. They don't build those half-timber homes anymore. They're very traditional. I'd love to tour it. Perhaps I can ask the managing editor if I can do a story on it, and that would give us a good excuse to snoop around and find out who's living there, see if they'll let us look around and take pictures. It's certainly worth a try. As for the Yeagers, that's a common name around here. One of the oldest families in the region, really. I suppose they're all related to each other in one way or another. Well, Jack was very grateful for the help. He retired early to give Kat a call. Meanwhile, back in Telluride, Kat was having a very successful gallery showing. Several large prints had been purchased, and she'd rubbed noses with many of the homeowners in the area, many of whom treat their million-dollar properties as their second home. Movie stars they were sports figures, politicians. You can see them all at a gallery showing in Telluride, and it wasn't even ski season yet. Well, everyone had been pleasant and welcoming except for one obnoxious customer. Kat had firmly told him no, this painting is not for sale when he inquired about her small portrait of the Wolfman, even though the plaque under the painting expressly pointed out those very words. He insisted. Kat stood her ground, and he became very agitated, a bit angry, and stormed out of the gallery, making a huge scene in front of the other patrons. It was embarrassing and uncalled for. Why that painting, she wondered. There was something about him that made her uneasy, and she thought about that as she closed up shop that afternoon. Jack was very concerned listening to Kat retell the event on the phone. Kat, be careful. There are people out there that can't be trusted. I'm worried about your safety. Oh, come on, Kat laughed. He was just a begruntled customer. I thought about removing it and bringing it home with me, but that's my favorite painting. I've not had anyone show any interest in it except you and now this guy. And I plan on doing a whole theme of werewolves and witches and vampires as my next installment, my next show, for Halloween that's coming up. And the other artists I've spoken to are excited about it. I think half the artists in this community are home painting werewolves right now as we speak. Kat laughed. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Jack remarked. Well, that night at dinner, Gerda's sister Luella, she brought numerous newspaper clippings to the table that she had found in her archives at work, including a few photographs of the old farmhouse. Now, Lou agreed to take Gerda and Jack to the house in the morning. She'd already called the current owners, and they'd agreed to let her do a historical interest story on the property. Jack was thrilled. Some things were just falling right into place. Lou had also found many references to the nearby village of gypsies. More clippings contained stories about their arcane practices and philosophies, arrests for fortune-telling within city limits, their thefts, and solicitation. Jack was surprised to learn that the locals seemed to believe the idea that the residents of the neighboring village were all witches, warlocks, and werewolves. The stuff of fairy tales. When you walk through that dark forest surrounding their village, there is an atmosphere that makes your skin just crawl. You feel like you're already being watched. The woods are silent in an eerie way. No bird song, no little chipmunks scurrying underfoot. There are wild beasts out in the forest that you don't want to come across at night. We have many stories of missing tourists and locals alike who've ventured into that dark forest for one reason or another, and they're never seen again. Now, a few years ago, a story came out in our newspaper that the villagers, they had a type of contagious disease, and that was enough to keep most people away from there. But as Gerda told you, we grew up near here. In that forest, as a matter of fact. We lived our childhoods in fear of what might kill us and eat us. We both had friends that disappeared, and we were never able to really keep animals as pets. Whenever a dog or a cat went missing, we always blamed it on the gypsies. The truth is, they are an unusual lot. They often come to town to trade their handmade trinkets and their herbal concoctions, or they set up a table to do fortune-telling in exchange for medicine, food, and tools. What they can't steal, they barter for. I don't think they have any actual monetary exchange in their village. It's all a system of barter. So many of the younger ones end up leaving the village and coming over to our town to work. But they don't stay here very long. The townspeople make them feel very unwelcome. But they are herbalists, and some members of our community swear by their natural remedies. They also make amulets, and those amulets are meant to keep werewolves and curses away. The tourists eat that kind of stuff up. They dress up in their traditional gypsy garb and pull up in their old sheep herders' wagons and set up a little market right at city limits, just outside of town, and also just out of the local gendarme's jurisdiction. Well, they'll tell fortunes and sell their trinkets and jewelry and herbal remedies. I've heard tell that the men can purchase an hour of pleasure with some of the ladies while their husbands stand guard outside. But that's merely gossip. Wouldn't surprise me, though. But every year, someone wanders into that forest and disappears. Kids, dogs, hunters, or the occasional teenager seeking some adventure. There's never any evidence to prove it was them. It's all very mysterious. You might call it superstitious nonsense. But old legends don't die around here, she added. The next morning, they had a quick breakfast and left in Luella's car to visit the house in Jack's photograph. It looked much the same as Ludolf Jaeger's. It was a half-timber farmhouse built in the late 1600s with animal stalls on the lower floor and the living quarters upstairs. Now, the current owners had done some remodeling, and there was scaffolding set up on one wall of the house where some of the plaster needed repair. The owners came out to greet him as they drove up to the house. Luella took on the role of historian and editor and made it all look very official, taking photographs, interviewing the couple. Jack, he had an opportunity to search for the cornerstone with the original owner's name engraved. As was the custom with these old houses, the name was not one he recognized right away, but he snapped a photograph with his phone and joined the rest of the group. The new owners did not know much of the history of the place, but they did recognize their house in Jack's photographs when he showed them. They said that they had purchased the home from a developer, and that he might be someone to contact for more information on the history of the home. They toured the grounds and the redesigned interior, took photos for Luella's story, then drove into town to visit the developer. Carl von Cleve was a heavy-set man who spent a lot of time sitting behind a desk. He boasted that he had lived in this little community for over 50 years and knew every part and parcel in the vicinity. He was good friends with Luella, invited the three to join him for lunch. Jack could tell he hadn't missed many meals, you see. The four walked to a nearby diner, while Carl regaled them with stories of his exploits as a kid. He seemed a likable, trustworthy fellow at first glance, and Jack decided he would pull out the envelope of photographs during lunch and ask Carl if he could identify the people in the photo. Well, Carl took one look and said, "Why, of course I know who these people are. They're the ones I bought the old farmhouse from. Wilhelm and Prudence Kell." She was a beauty. Back in the day, one of the prettiest of the Jaeger girls. She fell in love with Wilhelm and married him, even though her dad threatened to disown her. He didn't feel Wilhelm was worthy of his daughter. It's an unfortunate story how I came to purchase the house from him. You see, in these parts, you leave your property to your children. It had been left in the Kell family for generations, and he and Prudence had 2 children. They had a boy and they had a girl. The boy was always a little bit off, if you know what I mean, troubled. The girl was beautiful, like her mother. Wilhelm, he took to drinking and liked to beat the boy something fierce. Well, the boy just snapped one day and nearly killed his father. He was sent away and became one of Hitler's henchmen during the war, from what I hear. And then the girl, well, she ran off with one of the gypsies, and no one knows what became of her. So Wilhelm and Prudence They were getting up there in years and they had no heirs to leave the farm to. So they were forced to sell. Now, I bought the property and then I resold it to the folks that you met this morning. Not much else to the story, I'm afraid. Carl ended as the waitress came with their meals. Now, Jack was still puzzled about how these were all connected to the photographs and how he and Kat fit into this picture. It was like trying to put together a big crossword puzzle, and some of the pieces were still missing. There was one more place Jack wanted to go. He wanted to see that village of gypsies. He couldn't help but feel that somehow that place was connected, and he wanted to bring back an amulet for Kat. She would find it interesting and maybe be able to use it in her art installation. He asked if he could borrow Gerda's car for the afternoon. She reluctantly complied. She'd taken to Mother and him, and he'd just about had enough of that. He needed to have the peace and quiet of the afternoon to himself. The women had been very helpful, but he needed to figure the rest of this out by himself. He drove out of town and he followed a forested lane for several miles to a dirt road turnoff. It was indicated by a simple sign that had a circle with a cross through it and another symbol under that, which Jack did not recognize. The narrow dirt lane ended another mile up the road. The forest was very dark and dense. A few small wooden houses were tucked into the trees. They were becoming closer together as he reached the outer boundary of this small village. It did have an ominous feel to it, he noticed. All the houses were very small, and none of them had any landscaping of any kind. There were no fences, but many had rusty vehicles and farm implements, and occasionally a dog or a goat would be tethered to a post at the corner of the house. There were clothes on the line at several of the houses and a few children playing outside. He saw faces looking at him through windows and doorways, but no one gave the appearance of being welcoming or friendly. Every glance he received looked suspicious. A few of the women came out of the houses and stared at him, their hands on their hips, with their hair tied up in scarves. He drove through town very slowly, watching them as they watched him. He saw no men at all, not a single one. He thought that was very strange, but he figured they were out working in the forest, cutting timber, or whatever else they did. And it didn't take long to reach the far side of the village. There were no stores, no cafes, no merchants, just homes. No wonder they came into Luella's village for the things they needed. There was really nothing more than a big compound of homes. So the road led on into the forest. He didn't see any reason to go any further, so he turned the car around and started back through the narrow street. He saw a woman standing at her front door and pulled the car up to a stop in front of her house. He gave a slight wave to see if she would respond. Well, she didn't. He decided to take a chance, and he stepped out of the car, asked her if she could direct him to some place he could purchase something for his sister. He couldn't think of anything better to ask. The woman raised her hand up to her eyes as if shielding them from the sun and waved for him to come forward with her other hand. He felt nervous and he felt tense. He felt vulnerable. He realized that he didn't have his gun, and the pocket knife he carried wouldn't really make much of a dent if he was attacked. But he walked towards the woman anyway. She was very lovely, with beautiful dark eyes that had a sensuality to them that was unnerving. Jack explained that he wanted to buy an amulet for his sister, and the woman laughed. She reached up and touched his face and ran her fingers down his neck to the point where his shirt was unbuttoned, and nodded with her head, beckoning him to come inside. He understood how easily a man could succumb to this wild gypsy charm. He nodded his head. No, he wouldn't fall for her seduction. He turned to leave and took a step towards his car. In that instant, she sprang at him. He heard his shirt rip and felt razor-sharp fingernails across his back. He whipped around and grabbed her by the back of the neck, pulling her hair and forcing her head to tilt back, while he grabbed her arm with his other hand. She let out a hissing growl and her lips curled back into a snarl. He felt the beast rise within himself. His blood was pounding in his ears, and he felt the saliva forming in his mouth, the fangs beginning to come forward. She tore at him with her free hand, but he was much stronger, and he forced her down to the ground, pinning her arms with his knees and keeping one hand against her throat. She struggled with all her might to break free of him, to bite him, but he kept her pinned. He had never hit a woman in his life, but this was not a woman. Even as he held her down, she had begun her transformation. He swung back and planted a powerful blow to her chin. She let out an unearthly howl, and Jack raised his head and howled in return. It was the first time the primitive sound had escaped his lips, and it felt good. He clenched his teeth together, and he felt his lips rise into a snarl. He was the dominant beast, and she cowered and settled, becoming a woman again. He got up off of her, and they shared a look of understanding. He turned, and he walked back to the car. And as he drove away, the women came out of the houses and watched him. He was one of them, and they let him leave. As he reached the end of the dirt road where the sign with the circle pointed towards the village, there was an old woman standing there. She raised her hand. She beckoned for him to stop. He pulled the car up beside her, and she handed him an amulet attached to a leather thong to hang around his neck. It looked as if it had been crudely carved from bone, and it bore the symbol of the circle with the cross through it and that mysterious symbol underneath it. She whispered, "Wear this for protection. As long as you wear the amulet, you may walk among men." Then she spoke some words in a language he didn't recognize, and she touched his forehead with her fingertip. He nodded a thanks to her, and he drove away. Gerda met him at the door when he reached Lou's house. "We were worried about you," she said. There's someone here who's asked to speak to you." He followed Gerda into Lou's dining room, where he sat with a woman who looked ancient. She had long gray hair and braids that were twisted with beads and little bells that tinkled when she moved. Her face was weathered and deeply wrinkled, and her eyes were dark and rheumy. She wore many strands of beads around her neck and a faded yellow peasant-style blouse and a long, dark, purple-colored skirt. If ever there were a fortune-teller straight from the movies, this was it. Wrinkled, bony fingers grasped Jack's hand and turned it over, studying his palm. Her fingers traced the lines in his palm. "You have the mark of the wolf, but you are not a killer, Jack Moore. You are a hunter. And you are needed back home. You must leave immediately. Your sister is in danger." "My sister?" Jack quickly asked. "What do you know about my sister?" The old woman held her finger up to her lips and whispered, "Shh. You have secrets you must keep. Your sister comes from a long line of the Volkolak. They came from Bulgaria in 1500s. Their line is strong. She was given to your mother for protection, and now you are her protector. You bear the mark of the wolf, and it is your duty to protect the queen of the gypsies." "Gypsies?" Jack asked. "When Catherine was born, she bore the mark of the wolf, but her father was a gypsy. Catherine was the child of Hannah Yeager's lover. If Gunther had known his wife was pregnant with another man's child, he would have killed her. So she fled to the United States and gave her daughter to her sister, your mother. Gunther tracked her down and found her in Montana. She refused to come back to Germany with him, so he stayed there. Much later, Hans was born, and he too bore the mark of the wolf. Your sister Catherine's father is my son." Jack's head just spun with dizziness. This was all so difficult to take in. There were still so many unanswered questions. His mother was Hannah Yeager's sister? Catherine was Hannah's daughter? Wow, So Catherine and Hans were really siblings. And why had Jack's mom and dad kept this a secret for all these years? Jack was 5 when Catherine was born. He never questioned his mother when she brought baby Catherine home. Now that he thought about it, though, he didn't really remember seeing his mother pregnant, but he was 5, and it never occurred to him that there was anything strange about that. And if Gunther, Hanna, and Hans were all werewolves, what did that make Cat? And why was Cat in danger now? The old gypsy woman shook her head and told Jack she could say no more, that all would be revealed in time. Jack and Gerda left early the next morning to head back to Bedburg. Jack's flight was scheduled for later that afternoon, and he knew he had barely enough time to pack and take the train to Dusseldorf, where he would catch the flight back to the States. He tried repeatedly to call Catherine, but she was not answering her phone. He did phone Ludolf Jaeger to apologize for leaving so quickly and promised he'd be in touch. Then he made the phone call that he was dreading. Professor Luther should have been disappointed that he wouldn't be able to try out the effects of his cure, but he appeared to be more disappointed that he wouldn't be able to gather some of Jack's blood. There was something in the way he responded that made Jack feel uncomfortable. Perhaps Luther was not being truthful with him. Well, it didn't matter now. Jack had to return to the States quickly. Catherine, she was in danger, and Jack's cure would have to be postponed for now. During the flight, Jack tried to put all the pieces together. He'd gone to Germany to find a cure for the changes that were occurring inside himself, changing him from a man to a wolf. He'd gone specifically to seek out information about the Jaeger clan so he'd better understand what had made them change into wolves in the first place. Not only had he found the relations of the Jaegers, but he had learned that his life was connected to theirs in a way that he never could have dreamed of. He dozed fitfully. His hands moved involuntarily up to his amulet he wore around his neck. In his dreams, he felt himself running, forever running. Catherine had arrived at the gallery early, only to find the glass display window on the right side of the door had been smashed in. Broken glass littered the sidewalk in front of her gallery. She gasped. Her alarm had not gone off. She quickly dialed the police department to report the break-in. The dispatcher took down all the information and told her not to go inside, but she was to wait until the officers arrived. So as she stood outside the new gallery crying, she tried to reach her brother by telephone. She saw that she had several messages from him. Funny that she didn't hear her phone ring, she thought to herself. He said he was on his way home and something about danger. The 2 officers arrived and made sure it was safe for Catherine to enter. Inside, there didn't appear to be any real damage other than broken glass everywhere. None of the paintings were missing, she thought, until she noticed the empty space in the far back of the gallery. Her painting of the werewolf was gone. In its place was a handwritten note that read, "I'm coming for you next."